Thank you for stopping by. For those of you who watched my previous video and are here now because of it, welcome back to my channel. And for those that missed it, allow me to fill you in. As you can tell by the title and thumbnail, we're going to be reviewing the latest installment of the You book series, For You and Only You, a Joe Goldberg novel. Thanks to the author of the book, Caroline Kepnes, I was supplied with an early copy of it, and in my video, I was able to review it ahead of its release. However, that was a spoiler-free review. The book had not been out yet, and I didn't want to divulge any of the book's context too far ahead of the release. But now we're back and ready to fully dive in about my favorite plots, characters, and the ending. And to be clear, I'm not 100% certain when this video is coming out. The official release date of the book is the date I had in mind, so it could be that day, if not the day before. Nevertheless, I'm glad to have you all here. Now let's get on with the video. As I mentioned in my spoiler-free video, the book brings us to yet another new beginning for Joe. Specifically, at Harvard, where he's attending a writing fellowship. He and his new love interest, Wonder, are the only ones there who aren't rich and privileged. They're all out there and their personalities show, but for Wonder, Joe considers her a true writer, closed off, just as Joe is. Now, for a bit of background on who Wonder is, and I actually mentioned this to Caroline, I said that she actually reminds me a lot of Beck. Imagine Beck, an aspiring writer from a not-so-wealthy family, struggling to navigate her adult life, but instead of just dealing with the school-related issues on her own, Joel is going to school with her, and is a participant in more areas of her life than just tracking her down and getting involved. In Book 1, you had the bookstore. In Book 2, you had maybe Joel's new apartment in LA and the production set for 40's movie. And in Book 3, you had the library. In Book 4, on the other hand, you have the fellowship. Everyone's written a book or a galley, and every week it's someone new's turn for the class to go over their pages, with the hope that they can all work together, get better, and become published with the help of the professor. The story makes it move in the background, with Joe stalking Wonder, learning about her family, her work environment. She also works at Duncan, and her history with men. The thing that makes it easy is that for Joe and Wonder's book, they wrote books that are reflections of their life story. So when the characters read Joe's book, you more or less get his relationship history, his relationship with love as an idea. In fact, one of his exact words in the book was, "I think the world's most misunderstood, overused word is love." And I agree with that. Oh, and fun fact, Joe drives a Tesla in this book. And I've got to be honest, I didn't think that Joe would like the idea of driving a Tesla. With his minimalistic approach to life, his old-fashioned sense of liking simple donuts, collecting typewriters, and seeing books as the most valuable item in the world, the idea of him being a Tesla driver just sounds very opposite to all that. However, I don't remember it being explicitly stated why he went with the Tesla. Maybe it was his best option compared to the other options. But anywho, moving on. Those of you who watched my spoiler-free review may recall that I mentioned this book having a piece of the spinal cord that is something that happened during the events from which You Love Me ended. That would be Ethel Rose Baker. She's an author, and when Joe introduces himself to the group, he says that a book of hers by the name of Conching was the last book that he had read. In my notes, I called it the book of the book, as in this fictionalized book kind of sets the tone for the actual book that is being read. And here's something that I had noticed. When Joe mentions the book to his fellowship group, not even days later, Wonder reads the book herself and gives it a review on Goodreads. This is part of how Joe does his digging for Wonder. She's basically a chronic reader, so he reads all of her book reviews. In her reads, she relates them all to her personal life. This book in particular has a lot of parallels between what goes on between the characters of it and what happened with Mary Kay DeMarco in the previous installment. And that's where Wander's empathy lies, giving me the idea that they're compatible because she would already understand what Joe had been through with her, his actions even, including murder. It's 50 chapters, so there's a lot that goes on, and it'll be pretty hard to go over it all without making a very long video, but I like how with every love interest, they're able to establish what's so special about them and how we can appreciate them as we continue to read. Another thing that stood out to me personally was that there was a bit of information sprinkled in about Joel's mother, the cusp of why he is who he came to be. I even think that they name dropped her as Alma. In his head, he says he thinks she's still kicking, meaning there's a small chance that she's not alive without him knowing. When asked if they're close, he says yes, but in his mind, he condemns being acted by his mother, of course. And when asked if his mother read his book, he says not yet, which could mean that, like the show's Joe, there's not much of an up-to-date relationship between Joe and his mother. They probably haven't met since he was very young. That actually becomes kind of a very small thing between Wonder and Joe. One of Wonder's last bits of advice to Joe is that he needs to see his mother. I wonder if that'll become something crucial for the next book, but who knows. Joe doesn't question his past, he says. Since we're on the topic of Joe's family members, we're also given insight on, oddly enough, his grandfather. Joel's granddad had rotten childhood. His old man, Joel's great-granddad, was a textbook drunk who smacked him around, eventually taking out his left eye. As a result, Joel's granddad wore an eye patch. He died before Joel was born. This is unusual information, and I don't think it's as significant as any information about his mom or dad. But when a character like this is such a mystery, any information or clues given is very much welcome. But I also want to add on to that by saying that if this type of insight can be this curious and specific, then won't that also be the case when we finally learn about his parents? That's something to think about. That's actually not it from this book when it comes to Joe's family. We have a bit more to go over in that regard, but before we do that, I have to talk about my favorite character in the book, that being Sarah Beth Suelos. I have a lot to say about this character, and I don't even know where to begin if I'm being honest. Sarah Beth is a part of the Fellowship, same as the other characters. She's already been published, she's already a celebrity to the point where if you say that you're her spouse at a bar to a random stranger, they'll be intrigued by that fact and get all over you, which is actually something that happens when Sarah Beth takes her husband Kevin to a bar to squeeze information out of him. Sarah Beth is the crime fiction writer of the Fellowship. Her art is killing off characters that are metaphors for people she knew in her life. And she starts paying special attention to Joe after a podcast is released called The Body on Bainbridge. For those who don't know, Joe lived on Bainbridge Island during the events of the previous book. They covered a podcast in class, as a matter of fact. Everyone shares different theories about which character from the previous book might have done it. It actually felt reminiscent to hear those names again, and to hear Joe get in his head about the truth. Sarah Beth seems to be the only person who keeps her eye on Joe about it, and that's all because he made the mistake of mentioning it that before he lived in Florida and owned the bar/bookstore, he lived in Bainbridge. This leads to Sarah Beth going all detective mode and asking him tons of questions, and eventually, she manages to not only catch on to Joe, but also catches him in a trap. Not to turn him in, but to solve the real-life murder, as that's one of her dreams, and she truly is obsessed with the podcast. After all, she is the murder writer of the Fellowship. She also seems to be wanting to use Joe's story for inspiration. So, while he's stuck in her house as a result of her own elaborate plan, after a lot of resistance to her BS meter, she records tapes of him telling her absolutely everything, including the parts that he would forget at first. And that's not all. She's also hired a PI, hunted down Officer Nico, and zoomed with Dr. Nikki. The thing about Sarah Beth, though, is that she isn't out to get him. She actually agrees with some of Joel's murders and doesn't see him as a bad guy or good guy. There's also the fact that he didn't kill a single person in the previous book. His risk factor when it comes to Sarah Beth isn't even getting caught at this point. The real risk doesn't come until everything he said is taped and then used for Sarah Beth's studies. She believes that Joe isn't a serial killer because he doesn't go hunting for victims. He loves his women more than he loves himself, and that deep down we all want to be held accountable for their actions to the fullest, which is why people can only dream of doing it, which is why people read her books. Overall, Sarah Beth and Joe are kind of on the same page, except for where she has the wrong idea. To Joel's regret, Sarah envies how quote-unquote evolved he is. She tries to use his capacity for murder to her advantage. She tries getting him to murder her married and successful ex-boyfriend from a different lifetime that she still cannot get over. And since Sarah is really good at placing Joe in front of her, he has to put up with it. Plus, he still has his tape confession story about, so it's not like he has reason to stay away either. She dances around this idea that she knows better than Joe, that Joe can learn from her, but also that she should be more like Joe. Eventually, Sarah Beth Swallows shows us what kind of influence a person like Joe can have on an adult who is still evolving. Similar to how we've been shown in the show, what kind of effect he can have on a child who is still evolving. Instead of acknowledging the good and bad of it all, Sarah Beth concludes that Joe is happy because he takes the leap and kills people. He's evolved because of that experience. Sarah Beth concludes that this is the way, that this is the route she has to take if she wants to be like Joe, that sometimes people deserve to die, and that she'll be better off if they are. And towards the end of the book, that's what happens. She relates to Joe, then becomes someone like Joe by taking it upon herself to kill her ex. I love this detail, I love this exchange, I love this outcome. This is what made me fall in love with the character. Since I've now given you the necessary background on Sarah Beth, I can now continue from where I left off on something about Joe's family. There's this paragraph cliffhanger where Joe says it's time to talk about his mother because he needs his tapes and Sarah isn't giving them because they haven't been helping and she feels like something is missing from them. But then the context is skipped over in the next paragraph. Joe says that the half stuff he mentioned was made up, which isn't bad when you consider the predicament he was in. But it also reminds you that we're on Joe's fourth book and we still don't know too much about everything. Only his present experiences. A lot of important character elements seem to come from his past or things we don't know yet. Yet now, it's like we'll never know if we don't know it soon, because what if the series ends without us ever knowing? The way that the paragraph ended on a note telling us to brace ourselves for the full rundown, for us to then get nothing from it, felt kind of avoidant if you ask me. That was kind of my only issue with the book, but there is one more that we'll get to later. Wanda and Joe disconnect suddenly in paragraph 33 after a fight about her plagiarizing part of his book, the metaphor for mouse in the house that Dr. Nikki used about Beck. She ends things on a positive note, but as soon as she's out the door, she texts him that they need a book and that Joe should do his own thing over Thanksgiving break. She even stops attending the fellowship after this. The whole character disappears for several chapters. She is practically excluded from the entire story. No, seriously, she disappears from paragraph 3 all the way until the very, very end of paragraph 41, during which Joe decides on different reasons behind why she truly needs space. Turns out, she walked out the way she did because Joe was right. She did in fact plagiarize his book, and she admits to it in her messages with Sly. This is the part where I like to acknowledge the fact that Caroline Kepnes writes her female characters with no filter. That's one of the things that I actually noticed a lot about this book. You see, there is no women are always to be understood agenda, or all characters other than Joe must be insufferable to balance up his character. There isn't an abundance of men being the antagonists, or women being blameless. Everyone, both men and women, have their good and bad traits, including the really good traits and their absolutely terrible traits. Sly Karen is the perfect example of this. She has this level of bitterness, guilt, shame, and toxic femininity that is actually an evolution from who she started as. And even Wanda starts to show herself in different shades as time goes on, and you don't really realize how it all starts crumbling down into the climax. The reason why I like to point this out is because when I associate the way Wanda handled herself, it didn't just feel like a fictional story being told or the plot being moved, because I was also able to associate it with how some of the actual bad apples in the real world would actually behave in situations like this. Such as Wanda walking out for being accused of something she did, and Sly Karen telling her that Joel's a bad man who doesn't truly love her for accusing her of such a thing, even though his suspicions were correct and he was right about it. In other words, it felt realistic, and I feel like nowadays in the media, instead of being authentic about these sorts of things, there are some select groups who would rather pad it up with some deeper meaning that justifies a dishonest portrayal. Instead of just going, hey, let's be real. This is how some men act, and this is how some women act. And it can be a very bad or toxic thing at times, but it would be worse if we lied about it. So, Caroline, you've definitely gained more of my respect with that. The book essentially ends with Wonder and Joe falling out of love. They approach life in two completely opposite ways. Joe is content with the fact that they are meant to be together, despite having not completely shaken her off, which is to be expected. He can't move on completely so immediately. Nevertheless, this ending is unique, especially when you consider the note we're left on. Joe isn't approached or leaving us with his eye on another woman. We're not left with a cliffhanger of him being left with someone who he's meant to be with. Instead, he's on a murder mission to kill everyone else he deems responsible for splitting he and Wonder apart. No new love interest, but a new motive. He leaves to go to Maine with Sarah Beth as an ally. They go to a house she owns there, so it looks like we'll be seeing more of her. The Body on Bain Bridge podcast that put Joe on her radar dissipated like most things in media do when another dead body became fresh news. So that story kind of wrapped itself up. My only other disappointment is that Joe never got his tapes back. It helps that he's not done with Sarah Beth, so it might happen in book 5, but I feel like with the amount of times Joe went on about those tapes and even coming close to obtaining them, it was too big of a deal to not conclude it in this book itself. So I really hope they do it justice if the next book gets confirmed. Maybe it'll be the next urine mug, like what happened with Love, Quinn, and Hidden Bodies. Maybe it'll have its own special plot surrounding it, featuring Sarah Beth. As I've mentioned earlier, the book is 50 chapters long with an epilogue chapter that comes after that, so I was not able to go over everything. There's storylines I haven't mentioned, there's characters I haven't mentioned, and I really want everyone to get the full picture, so please, I encourage you all to buy the book. And I mean that genuinely. This is all a courtesy of Caroline Kepnes, not a sponsorship. The Joel Goldberg story, both in novelty and on the screen, is one of the fandoms that I'm most passionate about. Literally. So I wouldn't be recommending it if I don't think you'll enjoy if you'll all enjoy it. I actually am expecting the audiobook that I pre-ordered when the book was announced. Some of you are going to hate me for this, but this is actually my first time reading a book in this series. I'm actually an audiobook listener when it comes to the Joe Goldberg novels. I have every single one of them. I recommend those as well. Santino Fontana actually sounds a lot like Penn Badgley, and his tone of voice fits perfectly for the book version of Joe. Other than that, I think that I've pretty much covered enough. I've told you about Wonder, what we learned about Joe's family, how the previous books present themselves in this one. I went over Joe's biggest vulnerability of this book, which would be Sarah Beth Suelos and the tape she recorded. And I've also told you how things end between Joe and his love interest, in addition to the note that this book ends on and how it sets us up for the future. Only things that I didn't go over would be Joe's victims this time around, a few of these shenanigans he got himself into, and I didn't elaborate on Wonder's family and support system with the other characters that were present through the fellowship. So I encourage you all to read all about it when you purchase the book. I hope I didn't exclude too much, but if I did, I apologize. I don't think I've actually reviewed a book on my channel before, as a matter of fact, let alone one of this volume. For those who have read the book, any criticism regarding anything that I should have talked about would be greatly appreciated. I'll try my best to be as inclusive as possible for you guys next time around. On that note, thank you all for watching. Please consider subscribing if you'd like to see more related content. I actually have some video ideas in mind with the recent release of Season 4 and the announcement of the 5th season being the final. So tune in by any means. Caroline Kepnes, I cannot thank you enough. We'll be in touch, of course. See you guys all again next time. Goodbye.